Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Her Song is a Sin, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lou1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by me, Britt. Her Song is a Sin. Chapter 12. The atmosphere in the car on the drive back to the mansion started out pleasant enough. After they had dinner and spent a few hours relaxing in front of the fire the night before, they had retired to Rael's bed, where they spent their remaining time together getting very little sleep. In the morning they had worked together to close up the bodyguard's home again, and now they were making the trip back. Rael took the long route and drove the Subaru over wet, leaf-littered country roads. It was a beautiful fall drive, and they chatted easily, enjoying each other's company. Rael was sad that their time together was coming to an end, though, and she tried to draw it out as long as she could. But eventually they reached the mansion, and she sighed as she paused at the gate. She heard Scylla mirror her sigh, and she glances at the brunette. Scylla looked up at the gates to the home she loved, and instead of seeing her usual sanctuary, saw a prison. After being away with Rael and the place of peace and no expectations, she was returning to her world where she had to be on stage in some form and fashion all day, every day. Rael squeezed Scylla's hand reassuringly and drove the Subaru through when the gate opened. As soon as Rael pulled up to the main house and put the Subaru in park, Garrett stalked out from the door of the mansion to the car and opened the passenger door. Rael heard him hiss something in Scylla's ear, and she very deliberately turned to Rael, ignoring the publicist. "Thank you, Ray. I had a wonderful time. I'll see you a bit later?" The musician paused for a moment and leaned over, kissing the bodyguard on the cheek. Then, reluctant, she got out of the car and followed her publicist while Rael started the engine again and moved the car closer to the guest house. Once Rael was at her home away from home, she killed the engine and got out. She moved to the trunk and she removed several cases with weapons, bullets, spare magazines, and a few other things she'd need. She'd convinced the brunette to let her set up a mini outdoor range on a far part of the property so that she could keep up her skills while at the mansion, and so that Scylla would have the opportunity to practice some more. She'd also brought a gun for Scylla, but planned to give that to her later. Rael fixed herself some lunch and then decided she would make rounds to check on all the security equipment. She would also scout out an area that might be appropriate to set up the range. The thinking time to herself, as her dad called it, would do her some good. She changed into something more appropriate for being out in the cold and headed out. When she reached the maintenance shed with the side-by-sides, she noticed one missing and assumed that Helen was out working on the ground somewhere on the property. She checked the other side-by-side and, once ensuring the gas tank was topped off, set off to do her perimeter check. The grounds were every bit as vast as Helen had warned about, and a great deal of the property was still woodland. Helen had said she tackled it a few times this summer with industrial equipment, but some of the more densely wooded areas were still untamed, as they were when the property was purchased by the Ramshorns years ago. From a security standpoint, the perimeter was secure, and all potential entry points to the grounds had been covered by gates and cameras. As Rael checked, everything seemed to be in good working order, and she was satisfied that the property was rivaling Fort Knox under her watch. After leaving the furthest entry point from the estate, Rael turned off the mowed path and ventured inward towards the woodlands. As the side-by-side bounced through the trees and brush-strewn areas, Riel took note of potential places that might make a safe outdoor mini-range. She had just took the side-by-side through a dense portion of trees when she came across a clearing, one side edged by a small creek. Riel stopped the machine and hopped out to take a look around. The area certainly seemed large enough for her purpose, and it was relatively easy to get to by taking the perimeter path. At this distance from the main house, the noise from gunshots would also be minimal. She walked along the creek for at least a half a mile in either direction, assessing the clearing. The walk gave her the chance to stretch her muscles, still pleasantly sore from the night before. The ache made her smile, thinking of Scylla and the way her fingers had felt moving inside of her. She'd had a wonderful time with the musician, and during the date discovered that they were extremely compatible, both in bed and out, and she was already thinking of asking her on another date. She stopped for a few minutes, taking in the animal tracks here and there where animals had trudged the creek to satisfy their thirst. Eventually, she turned from the creek and started across the clearing, intent on exploring the wooded area surrounding it. As she reached the edge of the wood across the clearing from the side-by-side, she slowed, looking at the ground. She'd seen a few tracks near the creek, mainly raccoon and some smaller mammals, and now she saw the telltale signs of a fox. No, a coyote, she thought to herself. She continued, moving into the woods, following a game trail. She could see the impressions of deer and more raccoon. She walked several feet along the trail and then paused, noticing that the woods had become extremely quiet. That tingle in the back of her neck came, and she stood very still. Then she heard it, the sound of another ATV. Quickly, she marched back towards the clearing and saw Helen in the other side-by-side parked by her vehicle. Riel reached her arm out in a wave and called out to the groundskeeper. She watched as Helen searched for the source of a sound, and then finally seeing Riel offer a wave of her own. They ended up meeting in the middle of the clearing. "I saw the Subaru, so I knew you were back," Helen said. She looked around the clearing and then met the bodyguard's gaze, her expression quizzical. "What are you doing out here?" Riel shrugged. "Checking the security and just exploring the grounds a bit." "Huh," Helen answered. "Well, you'd better be careful. There's been reports of a black bear around the area." Riel's brow quirked with surprise. "Oh, really?" "Yeah," Helen continued. She gestured vaguely in the direction that Riel had been headed, and added, "Over the years we've come across a few of them over there." Riel didn't think so. It was highly unlikely a black bear would be around this area, but she didn't say so to the groundskeeper. Instead, she followed Helen as the woman made the way back to the pair of side-by-sides. "Well, I guess I'll see you back at the maintenance shed?" "Yeah, sure," Riel answered, climbing back into her side-by-side. Helen got in hers, and Riel realized that she wasn't going to move until Riel did. After a few seconds, Riel called out over the rumble of the machines, "I'm going to ride on out and check the front gate area, and then I'll be back." Helen nodded, still waiting, and eventually Riel took off in the direction that she'd indicated. Back at the guest house, Riel could see that she'd missed a call from her dad, and several from a number she didn't recognize. She listened to the messages, rolling her eyes at the sound of Garrett on voicemail, first requesting, and then demanding her presence in his office as soon as possible. As soon as possible would have to wait until later, because Riel intended on spending the rest of her evening checking in with her dad, and then getting some much-needed sleep. She dialed the number and waited for her dad to answer. "Hey, Ray." "Hey, Dad, how's it going?" Good. Hey, Marcia told me you were out at your house earlier. Is everything okay with you?" Riel chuckled to herself. The neighbor who checked on her house and stocked it for her when she needed had met her dad when she'd first bought the house, and they'd become friends. She was a nice lady, though a bit nosy, and she certainly helped her dad to keep tabs on her. "Yeah, Dad, everything's fine. I just took a break for a day and picked up a few things I needed at the house." "Oh." Edwin paused for a moment and then said, "She mentioned that there was a really pretty woman with you." Riel rolled her eyes and shifted the phone on her ear. Yeah, Dad. First time you've ever brought someone to your house." Something your old man needs to know? Well, I met a girl, Riel began, a huge grin on her face. The next morning, not even the thought of her having to meet with the slimy publicist could stop Riel's good mood. She got up, a jaunt in her step, whistling to herself as she made herself some pancakes to go with her coffee. A quick glance at her phone indicated that Scylla's schedule was empty for the day, and she had every intention of finding the brunette after meeting Garrett and asking her if she'd go to dinner with her that evening. After she'd cleaned up and got dressed for the day, she took the footpath to the mansion and made her way inside. She knew that one section of the first floor of the house had been converted into offices for the publicist and for Isadora. Even Scylla and Byron had large offices. But she knew both preferred to work in the music studio, or in Byron's case, the art studio. When she started, she'd been offered her own space but preferred the privacy of the guest house, and so refusing the offer, citing the need to keep security matters separate from Scylla's day-to-day business. Now she made her way down the hall and knocked on the door. A woman's voice called for her to come in, and Riel did so, a puzzled look on her face. A young woman, barely 18 and beautiful, sat at a small desk just to the right of the entrance of the room. She looked up brightly at the bodyguard. "You need some help, hun?" Yeah, Garrett wanted to see me." "I'll check if Mr. Buttonwood is free," the woman replied, picking up a phone. The large room, probably a library at one time, had been separated by a set of glass French doors, and Riel could clearly see the publicist playing put-put on a little green mat beside his desk in the office. When the phone rang, he cursed as his ball missed a hole, and he answered the phone. Riel heard him ask what the girl wanted, and she quickly explained in hushed tones that there was a rather severe-looking blonde with a gun there to see him. Garrett looked up from his phone through the glass in the doors and met Riel's eye. She looked back at him, her gaze icy, and she noticed that he visibly shuddered. He spoke into the phone a few more seconds and then put it down. The girl looked up shyly at Riel. "Mr. Buttonwood will see you now." "Sure," Riel said. She walked past the desk and through the doors. By the time she'd reached the publicist's inner office, Garrett had sat himself down in a large leather chair, hands steepled together under his chin. "You wanted to see me?" Riel looked around the room, taking in the photographs of Garrett with various celebrities and the little gold records on his wall. Sleazy or not, it was obvious he had been good at what he did. "Yesterday, Miss Caller." "Yeah, well, yesterday I was busy. What do you need?" "Don't expect to be reimbursed for your time today." "What?" Riel asked, confusion taking over the annoyance on her face. "I said I will not be reimbursing you for your time today because I requested your presence yesterday. What are you talking about?" Garrett furrowed his brow at the blonde and continued almost as if he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say and couldn't compensate with the interruptions. "If you will submit a total list of your expenses, excluding your time here today, I will have a check cut within the hour." "I don't understand what you're saying." "Your services are no longer required." Riel's eyes widened, and she immediately began thinking back to the weekend. Had she done something wrong? Had there been a mistake? Did Scylla want her to quit? Why? How does that even make sense? We still don't know, Riel asked, her voice racing in the office. Garrett slammed his hand down on the desk and stood up, looking at the blonde. "You're fired, Caller. You know nothing about show business. Do you realize that she missed 3 interviews while she was out with you?" Riel blinked in shock. She didn't know. Truthfully, she hadn't even looked at Scylla's schedule. When she had asked the brunette a good time for their date, Scylla had suggested the time. "Well, if she wanted to miss the interviews, that was her decision. You're a distraction for her, and not a good one." Riel's jaw clenched at being called a distraction. "It doesn't matter. If she wants to spend time with me, that's between us." "Really? Who do you think signs the checks?" Garrett asked. He lifted his chin. "You don't realize how important my role here is." "Yeah, I get it perfectly," Riel answered, her voice hard. "Just get your shit together and be out of here by noon. You can email me the expenses. I'll get what you owed direct deposited." "What's going on here?" Garrett jumped and looked beyond Rael at Scylla and Isadora, who were standing in the doorway. I was just telling Caller that she would be leaving us. Rael stays, Scylla said simply. Garrett, you know that Scylla's more popular every day. With all of the media and the awards coming up, her life is more at risk now than ever, Isadora said. We can get someone else, Garrett answered. I don't want someone else. Rael turned to Scylla, capturing the brunette's cerulean eyes. She offered Rael a small smile before turning back to Garrett and continuing, It's Rael or no one. And there's no way she's going to Fort Salem without a bodyguard, Isadora added. She has to, Garrett said with a smirk, finally able to get his way in at least one area. You should know that, Isadora. You fixed the contracts. Fuck the contracts, Isadora said. If Rael goes, then Scylla doesn't step a toe in Fort Salem. After a moment, Garrett's shoulders fell and he dropped back into his seat. Fine. Whatever. He looked up at the blonde and pointed. But you need to stay in your fucking place. Scylla looked at her publicist, her gaze hard. Remember, Garrett, you may sign her checks, but I sign yours. She looked at Rael and jerked her head towards the door. Walk with me. Rael gave the publicist one last icy glare and followed Scylla out of the room. Where are we going? Rael asked. Anywhere but here, Scylla answered. She walked down the hall and stopped at the door to her studio. Taking a key from her slacks, she opened the door and motioned for Rael to join her. After a second's hesitation, the blonde followed Scylla into the room, stopping near the piano as Scylla sat down at the bench. Goddess, that man is insufferable. You apparently missed some interviews. Scylla rolled her eyes and looked at Rael. Can you blame me for wanting to be with you? Rael smiled. No, but I don't want to interfere with your work. We both have jobs to do. Scylla nodded, letting her hands glide over the keys. Looking at her bodyguard, she asked, Why don't you play with me for a little bit? Rael's eyes widened as she began to protest. Please? Scylla asked. Help me do my job, and I'll be more cooperative in helping you do yours. Rael swallowed and then spoke. Go to dinner with me. Scylla's lips pursed, and then she smiled. Are we still making deals? Always, Rael answered. Okay, the brunette said with a nod. Rael walked over to the wall of guitars and hesitated, looking back at Scylla. After the musician nodded her permission, Rael picked up the guitar that was similar to the one that her mother had owned and walked over to the stool near the piano. She sat down, adjusting her guitar, and once satisfied, looked up at the brunette. Scylla leaned back on the bench, nodding at Rael to begin. It's been a long time, she warned. With that, she looked down at the guitar and began to strum. After a few seconds, she took a deep breath and began to sing. When Rael had finished the song, or at least as much as she was willing to play, with Scylla staring at her, she ducked her head, blushing slightly. After a moment, she got enough nerve to look at the brunette in her eyes. You are amazing, Rael, Scylla choked, trying to swallow the emotions that the blonde's voice had evoked in the musician. I don't know about that, Rael answered. I mainly just picked with Mom to entertain Dad and the neighbors. Well, you pick beautifully, Scylla teased. Rael blushed again and then asked, So, how do you feel about Italian? Scylla knocked softly at the door to Byron's studio, and she heard his answering yell to come in. She stepped inside and took in the canvases in varying stages of completion, looking up when her brother approached her, walking over from one of the work sinks and wiping his hands off with a cloth. Scylla took a seat at one of the stools and looked over at her brother. Well? He asked expectantly. Scylla smiled. She's amazing. Byron perched on another stool and looked at his sister. Tell me everything. Well, it all started with a food truck. When Scylla finally finished her recounting of her date with the bodyguard, Byron smiled at Scylla and laughed softly. You really have it bad, don't you? Scylla's grin faltered. Byron, I have feelings for her. Byron nodded. I know. Am I setting myself up to get hurt? Byron shrugged. Please, I really want to know what you think. Byron frowned. He couldn't even remember the last time Scylla had used the word please with him, or anyone else, really. Probably when she'd played a female version of Oliver Twist in her 5th grade school play. Sil, you know I love you, and so I'm saying this out of love. You played the part Garrett gave you too well. What? You've always come off as this indifferent snob, only interested in sex. You made a big show of flirting around with this guy or that girl, but you never actually dated. You never spent more time with anyone beyond what it took to get off. You've been emotionally unavailable for a long time. Scylla swallowed. So you think this is all a huge mistake? Byron looked into her sister's eyes. He could see the hope in her eyes, and he could see her fear. No, Sil. I think that it's great. She's a good woman, and she's got a good head on her shoulders. I can see how she grounds you, quiets that noise you've always got going on in your head. Scylla nodded slowly. She asked me to go out with her again tonight. And I said yes. Scylla smiled, and then confided in her brother. We played together today. Byron smirked. I'm sure you did. Scylla rolled her eyes. No, I mean we played music together. She plays the guitar. Byron's eyes widened. Really? Her voice is incredible. She should be the one with a singing career. And you the bodyguard with a gun? Byron asked. He shook his head. I can't believe that you actually shot a gun. Byron, you should know I gave her permission to put a range out on the property. Byron jerked his head up at his sister. Scylla, you should have asked me first. You know how I feel about guns. Scylla sighed. That was a long time ago, Byron. I still don't like it. But I guess since you've already done it, I'll have to get used to it. He studied his sister, seeing the difference in the way she was carrying herself. She was calmer, more at ease, and it had been a long time since she'd seen her happy about anything that wasn't career-related. Scylla, I'm happy for you. Just take it slow. This is really new for you. Yeah, Scylla said. She knew that her brother was right, but it was hard to hold herself back. She'd held back, allowing herself to have emotions for so long now that they were coming to the surface. They had threatened to break out and overwhelm her. She stood and walked back over to the canvases that Byron had laid around. Are these for the exhibition? Yes, Byron answered. They really are amazing, Scylla said. She turned and headed to the back wall of Byron's work area and looked at the cloth covering a canvas. This is your masterpiece, though. Byron stepped up beside her and looked at the cloth-covered wall. His sister quirked a brow and he nodded slowly. Carefully, she removed the cloth, and they both let out deep breaths at the painting hiding beneath it. Scylla stared at it for several seconds and then looked at her brother. She could see the pain in his eyes. You should show this. You know I can't. Scylla shook her head. It was a long time ago. What if someone says something, and you know Garrett will freak out? Scylla shook her head, eyes flashing with anger at the mention of her publicist. Did you know that asshole tried to fire Rael because I blew off those interviews? He apparently summoned her to his office. He didn't even consult me. The thought that Garrett may have succeeded, and she would have woke up just to find that Rael had packed her things up and left, made her shudder. Shaking his head, Byron shrugged. He took the cloth from her and carefully covered the canvas again. He's been running your life for a long time. Maybe you're finally seeing that the advice he's given hasn't always been what's best for you. Yeah, like this. It was wrong of me to ask you to hide it away. I want you to show your work at the exhibition. If people talk, then they talk. I am tired of hiding. Bye. I deserve love, and you deserve closure. Byron looked at his sister, and after a moment nodded. He didn't know if anything would come out of putting this particular painting in the exhibition, but he knew that his sister would at least have someone who would be by her side to support her if things went south. Maybe it really is time for both of us. As Scylla watched the fat little man walk away from them, still playing the accordion he had propped on his belly, she thought that perhaps it was just a bit over the top. The food was heavenly, though. Homemade-style Italian with fresh garlic and tomatoes. The bruschetta appetizer had been divine, and the gnocchi with meat sauce was the best she'd ever had. The waiter had told her the secret was that the meat sauce was made with veal. The restaurant itself was small and cozy, and had that old-world Italian restaurant look from the early 80s. The decor was dated but authentic. She couldn't believe she'd never heard of this place, but it was apparently very popular. When Raelle had mentioned it, she admitted that she couldn't get reservations, and so in the end, Scylla had used her pool to get them a small candlelit corner table. When she had asked Raelle about the dress code, the blonde just scoffed and told her to dress casual. Still, she wanted to look nice, and so she'd worn a wine-colored silk blouse and a pair of black slacks, which ended up complementing Raelle's simple white shirt and maroon blazer with dark jeans nicely. All in all, they very much looked like the handsome couple in love. She could see why the accordion player had spent so much time at their table. Scylla took another sip of her wine and then put the glass down, watching as Raelle polished off the last of her meal. Smiling, she reached her arm out and offered her hand. Raelle took it while taking a sip of wine with the other. "For the record," Scylla said, "I would have come with you to dinner whether you played with me or not." Raelle blushed slightly and nodded. "Well, it was nice to play again. I'm still a bit rusty, though." "Then I can only imagine how incredible you'd be if you started back on a regular basis. You should play more often." Raelle met the brunette's cerulean gaze. "Thank you. I need a lot of practice, though, to get even close to your level." Scylla snorted and looked up when the waiter approached them with dessert menus. They placed their order and the waiter removed their dishes. "Speaking of practice," Raelle began, "I think that I found a place for the outdoor range." Scylla's brow quirked. "Already?" Raelle nodded. "Yeah. It's near the back entrance to the property. There's some woods and then a creek with a little clearing." Scylla nodded, remembering the spot from the description. "Did you see the pond?" "No, I didn't get much time to explore the area. Helen came by and said something about potential bears. Have you ever heard of bears being on the property?" Scylla laughed and shook her head. "That's ridiculous. I've never heard of anything like that." They paused the conversation as desserts and coffee were delivered, and after a second Scylla began again. "Though no one thought it was a good idea to tell me someone was making threats against my life, so they may have decided not to tell me about the potential bear. Besides, Helen and everyone knows I really don't go on that end of the property." "Why not?" Raelle asked. She poured their coffee from a silver pot and tugged into her cannoli. Scylla shrugged, taking a bite of her own dessert. She considered how to answer the question, just what she was ready to tell the blonde, then settled on partial truths. "My mom had a couple hothouses out there. She did a lot of research on various plants and fungi. After my parents died, I just didn't like to go out there anymore. The plants around the house are one thing, but all of that was her life's work, and it just stopped. Besides, some of the stuff she grew out there is really poisonous." Raelle's brow rose. She hadn't seen anything like that, but again, Helen had interrupted her before she could do much exploring. "Would you prefer I pick another spot?" "No," Scylla answered after a few minutes. "The clearing should be fine." "Good. Maybe once I've got it set up, you'll come shoot with me again." "Maybe," Scylla answered. They finished their dessert, and despite Scylla's insistence that it was her turn to pay for the date, Raelle paid. They were making their way to the front of the restaurant when Raelle had to sense that something was wrong. There were a lot more people standing around the front lobby than there should have been, for people just waiting to be seated. Immediately, she began to see the flashes and hear clicks. She stepped in front of Scylla, attempting to shield her, but she could feel the crowd pressing in. The maître d', seeing the distress that her paying VIP customers were in, stepped forward with the help of a couple waiters and pushed the crowd back. Before they could get out of earshot, though, she heard the reporters firing off questions. "Scylla, is this your new girlfriend? Hey, Blondie, what's your name? Is it true you blew off Ellen because she were here with Blondie?" Raelle rolled her eyes and looked at the brunette. "Fuck, Ray," Scylla hissed. Raelle backtracked into the dining area, away from the crowd, and grabbed the waitress on the way to the kitchen by the arm. She took out her wallet and thrust a few bills in her hand and explained what she needed. The waitress looked curiously at Scylla and then hurried off to the back. "What was that?" Scylla asked. "Did anyone know we were coming here tonight?" Rael asked. Well, I had Garrett make... Scylla's eyes widened. Oh, God, Ray, I'm so sorry. Rael's jaw clenched, but she shook her head. It's okay. What did you have the waitress do? She's getting my car and bringing it to the alley entrance. We can slip out that way. The waitress returned a few minutes later, and they were able to slip out into the night. As Rael whipped the car out of the alleyway, they could see the crowd of people that reporters were still pressing at the door to the restaurant. Well, we may not be welcome back there, Rael said. Shame, Scylla said. They really had great ganache. Rael looked over at Scylla, who met her gaze, and both burst into a fit of laughter. Back at the house, Scylla and Rael both stalked in, intent on finding Garrett. They didn't have to go far, as he met them just inside one of the living areas. Isadora sat on the couch and Byron paced back and forth, only stopping when his sister approached. He pulled her into a hug. Thank goodness you're okay. No thanks to Garrett, Scylla said, glaring at her publicist. It wasn't me, Garrett said, though it looks like they will already have more footage. While Garrett showed Scylla a video of her and Rael at dinner, apparently taken with a cell phone, Byron stepped forward with a copy of the Massachusetts Gazette and handed it to Rael. It was already folded open to the celebrity gossip section, and Rael's brow shot up as she read the article. Massachusetts Gazette, celebrity column, October 10th, 2021. The witch has a familiar. Male fans of singer, songwriter, and actress Scylla Ramshorn may be out of luck. Rumor has it that the sexy siren will be featured in an upcoming edition of The Advocate, where she'll spill all of her sexy secrets and talk about, that's right, her love of all things female. Could it be she already has a special someone in her life and in her bed? These photos were obtained by a source close to the musician. My, don't they look cozy. So far, Miss Ramshorn has been unavailable to comment. Rael looked at the photos that accompanied the article. They were clearly from the photo shoot when her arms were around Scylla. It was after Gregorio had finished taking pictures. She remembered holding the musician afterwards, one of their first real intimate moments. It looked like someone there had used their cell phone to take more pictures and leak them. It could have been one of the other models or the work crew, but she was certain that was Garrett. After a moment, Rael tossed the paper down on the nearby coffee table. I don't have time for this, Rael said. Well, Garrett said, you'll have to make time. If you can take the time to whisk Scylla away to some bumfuck hicktown and screw up her interviews, then you could take time to respond to this. He stared at the blonde, his face a visage of smug triumph. Rael gave a mirthless laugh. I don't need to respond to shit, and I don't work for you. Scylla winced at Rael's tone. Rael, I'm really sorry that this has happened. The brunette moved closer, attempting to reach out to Rael. This means nothing, Rael said, sidestepping the musician, and turned around and looked over at Garrett. You want a response? Write it yourself. I've got a job to do. With that, Rael stalked out of the room and down the hall. Scylla caught her at the door and reached for her arm. Rael, please. Rael stopped and took a deep breath before turning to the musician. Please what, Syl? Scylla closed her eyes and took a shuddering breath. I know that you must be angry about the obvious leaks, and I'm sorry that this has happened. That's the only reason I objected to you taking pictures with me. I didn't want your name dragged through the gossip columns. Rael reached out and gently grasped Scylla's chin with her hand. Softly, she said, I don't care about that. I only care about doing my job and keeping you safe. I can't do that when I have to deal with these type of distractions. Scylla swallowed, taking Rael's hand away from her chin and squeezing it. I will take care of this. Rael nodded. Good. Ray, for what it's worth, I had a good time tonight, Scylla added. Rael nodded. So did I. With that, Rael leaned forward, kissed Scylla gently on the lips, and then left the mansion for her guest house. Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.